Well, I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank the American Prospect, Open Markets Institute, and the Kauffman Foundation for putting on this event with us. I'm Jim Antle. I'm the editor of the American Conservative magazine. And in this panel, we're going to discuss, is there some potential for bipartisan cooperation on issues of economic concentration and monopoly? Are we seeing some left-right convergence on this issue? Certainly, there is a long and storied history of progressive opposition to concentration of corporate power and monopolies, but certainly on the right and the center-right, during the Reagan years, Chicago school economists and various other factions in the Republican Party took what I think might be described as a fairly relaxed attitude toward antitrust enforcement. But there are some signs that maybe that's changing, and there are sort of three factors in why that could potentially be changing. One is the rise of China has certainly changed some conservative perspectives on this issue. Another is concerns about big tech and the major social media platforms as well. And then there's just, I think, an overarching worry among some on the right and center-right that monopolies could be harmful to entrepreneurship, creating new barriers to entrepreneurship, and just the overall cultural, social, and political consensus that's necessary to sustain support for free markets. And so the believers in free markets have to be concerned about whether we have a political and economic system that's going to sustain free markets. But certainly there's a lot of activity on the left and center left on this issue going back a long way. So the question is there some realistic prospect of bipartisan cooperation on this? So we have a panel of experts who can talk about some of their perspectives on this and share their expertise with us. We have Liza Lovdahl Gormsen with us. She's the director of the Competitive Law Forum. We have Sandeep from Open Markets Institute. He's their legal director. We have Guy Rolnik, a senior fellow at the Stigler Center. And so we're going to go left to right. So we'll start with you, Liza. What are some of your thoughts on this issue? Are we just hoping and dreaming that maybe some bipartisanship is possible in a climate where bipartisanship is very rare in general?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. And also, I would like to say that I'm an antitrust lawyer based in London. So my focus is very much on Europe and the UK. So, and we don't see the same bipartisans in Europe as you do here in America. So everybody is concerned in Europe and in the UK about the power of the platforms. They're very concerned about the increased concentration in a lot of sectors. And what's very interesting is that Theresa May, I know in the UK, if some of you have followed the politics in the UK, we seem to have a new prime minister every other month. But when it was Theresa May, what she did, she felt that we needed to do something about this. So we have here a conservative prime minister, and she then invited Professor Jason Furman from Harvard University over to do a review of the platforms really and the impact they would have on the economy. So it's quite interesting to see that the UK is relying on an American who used to be an advisor for the Obama administration, that a conservative prime minister inviting him over to do a review of the economy in the UK. And he did that and did that very well. And he, of course, engaged with the rest of the politicians. And what has happened is this has moved into the political space. And if you look at Germany and France, who are two countries that are very active in this space, and you have the UK being active, I don't know how much our voice will count anymore following Brexit. I think we'll be very marginalized, but besides that, so you don't see the same divide between left and right in Europe as you see. We see a picture where we have the left and the right and the center wanting to work together about this. They all are afraid of the platforms. There is an absolute paralysis, and there is regulatory stagnation, and everybody wants to do something, but of course it benefits, these platforms are benefiting politicians. So there is also very little they want to do because it's benefiting them. They don't need the BBC anymore, right? Because they can go directly out to voters through Facebook. So there is this mixed picture that everybody fears the platforms, everybody wants to do something about it, and yet they don't want to do something about it because it also benefits their political situation. So, and then we, of course, we hear politicians now talking about that China and Russia got it right. And that's very rare to hear such a thing, because the way that Russia and China considered data a security issue and said no data is allowed outside Russia, no data is allowed outside China or in, we don't want any mixing. And in that way, what's very interesting about that picture is that we know the reason why Russia and China deals with data in this way is because it's totalitarian systems. So it's not because they know that the harm to users in the way that they give up all their data. That's not the reason why. But having said that, it just means now that the platforms that could destabilize democracy in the Western world, China and Russia are using those platforms to do that. So it's incredibly interesting how naive I would think that the Western world has been on this. How naive they have been and how they have allowed Google and Facebook and whatnot to just grow into monopolies without thinking about what consequences that would have. And now being unable to really decide what they want to do about this. So we see a kind of regulatory stagnation and unwilling to really take enforcement action against the platforms, and yet they really want to do it. So we then had Germany, the competition authority in Germany took action against Facebook, but they didn't do that on pure antitrust grounds. They did it from a data protection law point of view. And of course, when Facebook appealed that to the court just dismissed the decision. That is now on appeal again, but it's just to say that whoever takes action, they don't get very far with that action. So it's a little bit of to say the least, a little bit of a disappointing pathway we're on. Having said that, there is also this thing in Europe about all of these companies, they're American companies, and then of course you have the Chinese equivalents. But very few of these companies are European, and we are being accused by the US for actually stifling innovation and over-regulating, and it's because of the regulation that we don't have these companies. It's because we don't allow these companies to grow in Europe, that we don't have such companies, and that we are somewhat jealous of that, and we really want this. But I fear that by the end of the day, it will have to be Europe that's taking a lead on this, like they took a lead on the general data protection regulation. Not that I think that has done anything good, but they took a lead on that. And I think they will have to take a lead again in antitrust enforcement against some of these platforms, because I don't quite see anybody else is doing it. But so very, very long answer to your question about the right and the left divide. We don't have that so much in the UK and Europe as you would see in the US. We have politicians that want to do something, they just don't know what they want to do, and especially because these platforms are also benefiting their careers.
Thank you. Sandeep, what do you think?
Sure. I'd first like to thank the American Prospect and the American Conservative for putting together this great event and inviting me to participate. So today's really an extraordinary, exciting time to be involved in antitrust, anti-monopoly debates. It's really the first time since the 1970s where we're having a serious discussion about the purpose and philosophy of antitrust, and it's probably the first time since the New Deal, if not the progressive era, when antitrust is a topic of public and broad political interest. So the encouraging thing is we've seen the end of one bipartisan consensus, and I think that is the technocratic, generally deferential to monopoly consensus that has existed since the late 1970s and certainly since the early 1980s. So what has this technocratic consensus entailed? It's meant that both Democrats and Republicans have broadly agreed on the need for restraining antitrust against mergers and monopolies. And we shouldn't let the rhetorical differences blind us to the broad agreement on what antitrust is supposed to do and not supposed to do. So to be sure, on the campaign trail, Democrats were much more likely to criticize certain corporations and call for populist economic policies, whereas Republicans often tripped over themselves to flatter the Fortune 500 and defend corporate prerogatives. But in practice, the differences were very much at the margins. The DOJ and the FTC have stopped relatively few mergers. And just think about some of the mergers that have gone through in recent years. Anheuser-Busch Miller, Bayer Monsanto, CVS Aetna, now potentially Sprint T-Mobile. These mergers were allowed in return for some modest conditions. So the companies were asked to sell off a plant or a line of business and allowed to consolidate. And it really makes one wonder, like, what is the purpose of antitrust law? What is the practical effect of antitrust law when the board and executives at Anheuser-Busch feel comfortable proposing to buy out Miller? 2 generations ago, these types of consolidations would have never even made it out of the boardroom. And the picture on the monopoly side is even sadder. The Department of Justice over the past 20 years has filed a grand total of 1 anti-monopoly complaint. So this is across the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations. And interestingly, I checked the stats this morning. The George W. Bush administration opened more investigations into monopolies than the Obama administration did, despite Barack Obama's pledge to revive antitrust in 2008. So in substance, there's been great continuity. Now it's clear this technocratic consensus is over. We have presidential candidates making antitrust and anti-monopoly a centerpiece of their campaigns, and even very middle-of-the-road members of Congress in both the House and the Senate are talking about the importance of reviving antitrust and even introducing good or very good bills on the topic. So that's the positive. There's a broad recognition that the bipartisan consensus has failed us, not only as consumers, but as workers, business proprietors, and ultimately citizens of a democratic society. So I think the big question, and a question that will be answered in the coming years, is there hope of breaking out of this bad bipartisan consensus and adopting a good bipartisan consensus, a populist consensus? So I'll start with the area where I see growing convergence, and I think this is specifically on Google and Facebook. So figures and organizations on the left, center, and right agree that these companies have too much power. And by too much power, I mean economic, political, and social power. I suspect the left, center, and right critiques of these companies are motivated by somewhat different concerns, and some of the stated concerns from the right give me some real concern and pause, but there is an agreement that these companies are too large and powerful. And I'm really encouraged by the recent multi-state announcement. I believe the attorneys general of 49 states plus the District of Columbia have agreed to open an investigation into Google, and I think there are similar numbers on a multi-state Facebook investigation. And so we're at a stage where the only real consistent defenders of Google and Facebook are the corporate defense bar and the libertarian right, and it shouldn't really come as a huge surprise that they're defending them despite the changing political winds. So I'm actually growing increasingly confident that these companies will be restructured in the very near future, and maybe even more importantly, their business models will be limited or outlawed. And by business model, I'm referring to their dependence on large-scale private surveillance. So this is the area where I feel optimistic that there is an important, albeit limited, consensus across the ideological spectrum. I'm pessimistic when we look more broadly. I'm not sure there's actually a shared vision here yet. So I think on the progressive left, there is a recognition that the monopoly oligopoly problem transcends tech. And so, for instance, I'll cite a tweet offered by Congressman Ro Khanna a few months back. So he cited some research done by my colleagues at the Open Markets Institute and noted that concentration is a serious problem in a number of sectors. And he cited eyeglasses, pharmacy, wireless service, washer and dryer manufacturing, and yes, mayonnaise. And so this is really everywhere. Tech is not the exception. It's really representative of a systemic problem. And so, for instance, the next panel will talk about healthcare, and monopoly and oligopoly are important drivers of spiraling costs in healthcare, specifically concentration in hospitals, and hasn't quite received the attention it deserves yet. But monopoly in healthcare is a big reason why we're spending somewhere between 1 in 6 and 1 in 5 of every 1 in 6 to 1 in $5 of GDP on this single sector. And of course, in the past few years, research has shown that concentration is a very serious problem in labor markets. Millions of Americans have only one or a handful of employment options, and this is an especially acute problem in rural areas, and may be a big reason why rural America is stagnating and increasingly falling behind urban centers. And looking more broadly, research has found that Walmart and Amazon depress wages systemically. They put real pressure on their suppliers, who feel extraordinary pressure in turn to cut wages and benefits for their workers to make sure that their margins are at least enough to stay in business. So the problem is everywhere. And my big question is, do conservatives agree with this? And I'm not entirely sure. Much of the anger on the right about monopoly has been directed at Facebook and Google. And a recurring question I've had is, what motivates this anger and resentment toward these companies? Is it simply that they are so big and powerful, or is it more a question of how they exercise their power? The perception that Google and Facebook are culturally liberal, generally more aligned with the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. Is it just a matter of how they exercise their power, or simply the fact that they have their power? And only time will tell what the true motive here is. And to the extent that it's just a question of how Facebook and Google are run and who runs them, I'm somewhat skeptical that we can actually forge a bipartisan consensus on anti-monopoly politics. But of course, I want to end on a cautiously hopeful note. This could change, and it could change very quickly. And I think something we have to recognize is that monopoly is an important driver of many of our economic, political, and social ills. We pay more for goods and services, including essentials. We earn less on the job. We have far fewer opportunities to start and succeed as business proprietors. And we live in a democracy that is increasingly democratic in name only. And I think there's also a general feeling that many of us, even those of us who are relatively well off and comfortable, have been robbed of our agency. Things are increasingly done to us. We have little or no say in how our society works and how it's structured. And I think an important point to remember is monopoly power is especially pernicious because we cannot exercise control in the two typical ways we exercise control. We can't vote at the ballot box, and we can't vote with our feet. Monopoly robs us of both voice and exit. So I am cautiously hopeful that anti-monopoly can be the basis for a new, small d democratic populism that unites the many against the privileged few who own and run the Fortune 500. And it's going to be a long, difficult, and challenging fight, surely one that'll feature many setbacks, but we need as many people inside the tent as possible if we are to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you. The guy?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'd like to first start with thanking the organizer of this important event, Jim and David. Having conservatives and progressives on the same page is an important milestone in the development of an anti-monopoly movement. And I hope this will have a follow-up. So I've been involved with this debate in the US in the last 6 years, and before that for more than 20 years in Israel. And I would like to offer some contextual and historical context to what we are discussing here today, and maybe later, if we have time, share with you my experiences in working with politicians, both on the right and the left. So in this era of political division, it's important to stress right from the start when it comes to consolidation of private power in the hands of the few, both the right and the left have failed the American people. To build up on what Sandeep said, so 2 years ago, when we were researching the questions how the US has become monopolized, I went and looked using a text analysis software at the platforms of both the Democratic and Republican Party in the last 140 years. And the key words I used were concentration, monopoly, competition, and antitrust. They have all but vanished from the political discourse in the last 50 years. They are making a big comeback this year. Now, I want to start with saying that I think that the question that we are facing here today is not antitrust, competition, and monopoly. It's how do we restore our democracy. This is the challenge that the anti-monopoly movement that we built here in the last 5 years is facing. Now, as a business and economics journalist and an entrepreneur, most importantly, that founded financial news media, I was always concerned with the questions of concentration of private power. In my 30 years in this space, I saw time and again under both liberal and conservative governments how private power subverts competition, politics, regulation, science, and the press. In Israel, it took us almost 20 years, and I have to say not only 20 years, but almost 2 or 3 times that we almost were going out of business thanks to the pressure from the oligarchs and their cronies until we were able to see meaningful change, and we did see meaningful change. It was not only the formidable opponents that we had, oligarchs and monopolies and their friends in politics, but most importantly, how do we turn an abstract idea of concentrated private power to something people care about as much as they care about issues that are part of their identity. What might have helped us during this campaign was competition in the cellular market, the mobile market. Our campaign resulted in introduction of competition to a cartel of 3 mobile providers, 3 companies. The same market structure we have today in the US. When competition started, prices dropped 90%, and I estimate that they can probably drop by half in the United States if we have competition here, and we don't. Now, the campaign hammered time and again that reining on concentration of private power is not owned by the left or the right, it's owned by the people. In 2014, after the Israeli parliament enacted the anti-concentration law, the international press asked, should the US take a page from the Israeli movement? I was skeptical for 2 reasons. I wasn't sure if there were similarities, and if there are, can something be done in a country where money dominates politics more than any country in the West? But when I started to do more and more research, I realized that the situation in the US is much more alarming than I thought. Monopolization or concentration has become the law of the land in many industries. One of the first things I did in 2015 after the joining the faculty of University of Chicago Booth Business School is together with Luigi Zingalias, that already back in 2012 wrote in his book that the US is reminding him of his own country, Italy. We put together a conference under the banner, do we have a concentration problem in America? That question was the state of affairs in 2016. And I remember when Barry Lynn from the Open Markets Institute invited me here to talk about the Israeli experience in 2016. I believe it was the first time that Elizabeth Warren addressed these issues. Those issues were not on not in the agenda, and I could not imagine that less than 4 years later we will not debate this anymore, but rather move to the next stage. What are we going to do now and how? Our conference in Chicago turned into an annual event, and now even the flagship event of the Stigler Center at the Business School. Last year we formed 4 committees of 30 experts that wrote policy papers, how to protect markets, politics, privacy, and the free press from the digital monopolies. Next year, we will try to come up with an intellectual and methodological framework on the questions of private power and politics and democracy. And here is the challenge. Once we have established that concentration of private power is a threat to our democracy, freedom, and liberty, and not only to prices, how do we rein that power? How do we identify, measure, and limit that political power? Now, looking at the last 40 years, one can say that many economists and legal scholars have failed us in addressing those issues. It's time to remember that we cannot separate economics and markets from politics. The founders of these disciplines called themselves political economists. And perhaps it's time to go back to this tradition and stop pretending that power is not in the center of economics, politics, and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the sort of tensions or possible impediments to bipartisan cooperation on these issues that I'm picking up here is that a large part of the growing conservative critique of large companies is a culturally conservative critique of the fact that these companies are run by cultural liberals, people who don't necessarily share their values. So to what extent, and I throw this open to the whole panel, to what extent is it a problem that much of the right has yet to embrace the full economic critique of monopoly power, or to what extent is it an opportunity that once conservatives begin to look at bigness as a problem, not just for government and labor, but also for business, is that an opportunity to create a broader coalition, even if some of the premises people are starting with aren't necessarily the same?
So one way to frame this, perhaps to frame this issue, is that a lot of the people that are avoiding this discussion and don't want to rein on those large corporations use rhetorics of free markets and so on. And in most cases, from my experience working closely with a lot of politicians, actually what is behind, this is a smokescreen, and behind this is whether you are pro-market or pro-business. And the tendency of most politicians is to be pro-business. And I'm not talking about small business or medium businesses, but big business. And once we have this discussion bringing together conservatives and liberals, we have a rare opportunity to remove the masks and see that actually it has nothing to do with ideology. It has to do just plain capture by money. And again, I share some of Sandeep's skepticism about what's going to happen looking forward. But it's both Democrats and Republicans that were oblivious and didn't do anything about it. And we know why, because money dominates politics. Money dominates many of our democratic institutions directly, and sometimes in other more ways that we cannot see them, like social capture, intellectual capture, and philanthropy capture, and on and on and on. And this is now an opportunity to start discussing those issues. We didn't have this opportunity for many years, and now we should ask tough questions, both people at the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It's high time.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pick up on your point with the money, because it's quite clear that the UK government is completely influenced by Russian money, Chinese money, and Arabic money. So I think it's a very valid point that you put forward about money, because it is the real issue behind the inertia, I think. And if you take a broadcaster like the BBC, you would see that's a non-advertising broadcaster in the UK. But BBC World in the US is advertised. So BBC in the US has a very, very close relationship with Google and Facebook. And BBC in the UK, for example, are completely cozying up to these platforms. And the way they do it is you cannot listen to the news for 5 minutes without having mentioned those companies at least 3 or 4 times. So imagine what that does to people, and imagine that young people now today, I understand that 70% of young people today get all their news from Facebook. And if that's the case, that is a one-sided news story young people get, because they are fed according to their political belief, and therefore, depending on what spectrum in the political spectrum you're on, you would get fed that information, disinformation, and fake news as well. And this is a very, very worrying trend, I would say.
Yeah, so I think there is a tremendous opportunity here, and the key is to use the cultural and social grievances against Facebook and Google as an opportunity and treat it as an entry point to introducing people to the broader problem of not only these two companies' power, but the power of corporations across the economy. So I think as an initial matter, we really need to do a better job telling the public that even if Mark Zuckerberg suddenly adopted the politics and affect of the Walton family, his economic and political power would be deeply troubling to all of us as members of a democratic society. And he would have decision-making power that we traditionally only entrusted to publicly accountable members of our government. So I think there is a real unique opportunity here, and it's one that we can't forsake. And I think more broadly, we have to emphasize at every turn that this transcends the tech sector. People are earning less at work, paying more for essentials, being robbed of democratic voice because of corporate power. And polls actually show that self-identified conservative voters are actually not that far apart from self-identified liberal or progressive voters on all these things, and feel a growing sense of disenchantment and alienation because they're working harder for less money and often unaffordable, not able to afford essentials that make life worth living.
Yeah, I want to add on what Liza talked about the BBC. So this is an interesting anecdote, but actually we see Google and Facebook trying to co-opt and news media all over the world. And this is where I'm today particularly concerned with that, because some of the policy ideas that are now coming out actually from Washington, but not only from Washington, is should we be taxing the platforms and transferring some of that money for the traditional news media? And I think this is a very bad idea. What we're doing here in economist lingo is sharing the rents. We have 2 huge duopolies that are extracting huge amount of rents and have gatekeeping power on all the information and the news in our world. And what we're and some people are just suggesting is that we should take some of that money, skim off some of that money, and bribe the news media. So I think this is a mistake. We shouldn't conflate. There is a problem with the business model of the news media, because investigative, accountability, democratic journalism, in many respects, is what economists call a public good. And we should address that and find ways to deal, and how do we finance this, how do we fund this kind of media. And then we have a problem with the control of 2 or 3 companies in of the distribution of and curation of news. We cannot solve those problems with one tool, like taxing them, and we need to separate the 2 issues. I see that some news outlets now that were They were covering the platforms in a very positive way until 2 or 3 years ago, because this was their distribution channel, and maybe they didn't understand the threats, and maybe they got some money from those platforms. Now we see them going very aggressively after the platform. So every day now we see a lot of people questioning the way that Facebook and Google are run, and they consolidate power. I want to make sure that looking into the future, the news media will continue to be aggressively criticizing big corporations and not find some solution that they come up together, at the expense of the public and our democracy.
I want to pick up on your word of tax, because it's interesting in the tax area, because the European Competition Commissioner, Mariette Vestager, she has been a competition commissioner for 5 years. She has just been re-elected, and not only that, she's also now the vice president of the European Commission, and she's also the head of the digital unit, or she's in charge of digitalization. And what she has done with these platforms, she's thinking, well, it's very, very difficult to do anything about this. So what are we going to do? We're going to go after them from a tax point of view. So they need to pay tax, and they need to pay a lot of tax in Europe. And because these companies are typically American, they will then repatriate their profits, or whatever profit they are making in Europe, they would have 5 years, I think it is, to repatriate that profit back to the US and then pay tax in the US. And she's sitting there thinking, we're losing out. So what she has done, she has used the antitrust rules to go after them in terms of tax, which is, of course, it's not ideal to use state aid and antitrust enforcement to go after them in order to get them to pay tax in Europe. So that, I think, was a very unfortunate mistake she did there. She used the state aid rules. I know in the US you don't have a state aid regime like we have in Europe, but she basically said that these corporations that operate in Europe, they have been granted an indirect form of state aid because they're not paying tax here. And therefore they need to do that. And then she used the antitrust framework to go after them. And it is very, very difficult. In the G7, they sit there and talk about international tax rules and what you would do about this. And it's an incredibly difficult issue with tax. And the OECD has been leading on this, what to do about the tax issue. But I definitely think that is not a way to hammer these corporations. This is not the way to do it.
So
it's not through the tax rule.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you, and I would say something. So I'm very supportive of what Margaret Vestager rhetorics, but when it's come to her actions, I believe actually that we haven't done much. And you mentioned before, first, we haven't seen real structural remedies, and when we look at those fines, I think, sorry for my language, this is pathetic.
It's pathetic.
A $5 billion fine for Facebook, just to give you numbers, I think that the free cash flow of Facebook in 1 quarter is more than $9 billion. So those huge fines that got the headlines, and probably politicians like it, there is a press conference, politicians come, the lawyers come, everybody is happy, 5 billion, 10 billion, 15 billion. If this is the way we are going forward, what we're only doing is turning this into a cost of doing business. Every now and then, you do an acquisition, you lie to the antitrust authorities. After 2 or 3 years, documents comes out that you lied before, you lied during, and you lied after you've made this acquisition. And then you pay a fine, which is like a week or a month cash flow. So we need to, Vestager is using all the rhetorics, and she's a hero in Europe, and I can understand why, because she was way ahead of regulators here in the US. But it's time to take real action, and real action means that we need to start thinking about real structural remedies, and we need to start thinking about going back to the origins of antitrust. Antitrust was a criminal thing for many, many years. Why are we using only civil law now? There's going to be a lot of documents coming out, because Congress is now asking for a lot of documents. And you know, maybe I'm speculating, but I think that if we read through all those documents or all those emails, and there are millions of that are coming out of the platforms, I'm sure that we'll find a lot of smoking guns of anti-competitive behavior, colluding, and so on and so forth. And now in the past, we used criminal law, and we used to investigate of people. Now, if you want to change norms, if you want to deter people, $5 billion fine won't do it. If you start real investigation, looking at the deeds of the top people, and you subpoena those people, you make them show up, then I think you'll start seeing totally different norms and behaviors.
Yeah, I completely agree with what's been said on this question. And I think the European Commission looks impressive relative to the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. But these funds really do amount to parking tickets. They don't address the core business models, structures, and practices. And I think this also relates to the question of how much should we rely on tax law and tax policy. I think it has an important role to play, but it would be a huge mistake to give up on anti-monopoly and competition policy here. We have to confront the core business models instead of meekly acquiescing to them. And I think going all in on fines and taxation also sends a really problematic message to other economic actors. It effectively amounts to saying, yeah, it's fine to move fast and break things, flout laws, ignore longstanding norms. It's okay. I mean, you might have to pay a modest fine or share a portion of your spoils later on, but we're not actually going to question it once you've busted through that initial layer of resistance and entrenched yourself. So I think we also have to look at this from a dynamic perspective. What are we saying to venture capitalists and other funders when we say that it's okay to break laws and simply ask for forgiveness later?
Let's throw this open to audience questions. We have a microphone over here. You could state your name and affiliation, and we'll do this according to Jeopardy rules, where questions are asked in the form of a question.
My name is Cammy Butt, and I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And my question is, isn't the evolution of capitalism that monopoly is still better in Western culture than compared to like South Asia, where I'm from? In Pakistan, India, for example, you have class 1 thieves who win the election by manipulating ignorant and illiterate people, and then their first job once they come into power is to take the money out of the country. So to me, capitalism or monopoly is still better because it doesn't allow these corporations to exploit to the extent that the capitalists do, landlord or feudal system does in the third world countries. Thanks.
Yeah, so you know, capitalists don't like capitalism. And the reason they don't like it, because they don't like competition. Nobody likes competition. So this is ingrained in the system. So this is why, you know, from Adam Smith to Sherman, everyone understood that, you know, capitalism will not survive and will not have legitimacy if we don't go aggressively after the people who are colluding, the people who are raising barriers to entry, the people who are capturing politics. This is a battle that we never win. We continue to, the pendulum always swings, and we continue to fight that. And we fought, you know, big banks 10 years ago, and now it's the digital monopolies. And probably in 10 years we're going to have other kind of monopolies. So it never ends.
So, yeah, I suppose contemporary capitalism is better than feudalism, but I don't know if that's the relevant benchmark or ideal that we should be measuring ourselves against. And I think more fundamentally, we should recognize that none of this is inevitable. A market is a product of numerous rules, and we can structure the market and, yes, capitalism to be progressive and promote broadly distributed prosperity and power, or we can do what we've done since the 1970s and structure the market that allows for concentration of wealth and power at the very top. So I think we need to resist the inevitabilism framework. There were countless legal policy and political choices that gave us the American political economy in 2019. And I think this goes to a point Guy made earlier. We really need to break down the artificial barrier between economics and politics. We need to think about political economy because all these questions are fundamentally intertwined.
I would say that interestingly, in Europe, we don't have capitalism as you know it in America. We have a social market economy. And maybe that's exactly the reason why we don't have these companies. Because let's just face it, while those monopolies have a huge impact in Europe, they are still American companies or Chinese companies. They are not European. So while we also have monopolies in Europe, of course, we do, it's just not super monopolies that you have here in the US. So maybe the underlying economic model makes the difference.
Yeah, but you know, bashing Europe is okay. But you know, when I look at Sweden and Denmark and Switzerland, when you look at the Heritage Foundation Index of Competitiveness, those are very competitive countries with some very large and very successful companies, high-tech companies, expert tech companies. There is a very thriving and strong venture capital space in all those countries. And yet again, the outcome in terms of quality of life, inequality, social safety nets is dramatically better than many of those facets in the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think we do need to critically examine what we mean by innovation. Innovation is not categorically good. Innovation can be quite bad and destructive. You know, innovation in chemical or biological weapons would not be the type of innovation we welcome or embrace. So I think we need to have a similar critical mindedness about innovation online and in the digital economy.
Yeah, so I would agree with Sandeep. So I have a lot of friends in high tech. Back in Israel, you know, high tech and venture capital is a very big industry. And I have to tell you, I'm not that excited to see that so many young and talented people are in the business of innovation, but most of the innovation is in one space, which is targeted advertising. And I'm not sure that what humanity really needs at this time and age is to have more and more sophisticated targeted advertising. And you know, this is what, and you know, we conflate it to say innovation, yeah, innovation, but you know, most of a very large percentage of our innovation to do actually is just finding a way to manipulate people by advertising and other means.
We want to get a couple more in before lunch.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk today. My name is Elliot Geiser with Boyd & Gray & Associates. I appreciate the emphasis on political economy, but one thing that the panel hasn't addressed is the extent to which complexity can form its own set of subsidy or barrier to entry for new market entrants. And as you're talking about how you fundamentally restructure some of the incentives in network industries, how do you do that in a way that is not in its own process locking in or entrenching existing market players? And I was wondering if you could talk about how perhaps deregulation or actually removing complexity can be a form of enhancement for competition as one of the tools involved in this process.
So I'll give one example that which is the Facebook a suggestion that we made my colleagues in Gales and myself 3 years ago when it comes to Facebook is what was mentioned here before, interoperability. I think that users on the internet should own their data. The data does not belong to Facebook. And once we establish, like cell phone companies don't own our number, and there is number portability. And when we own our data, and then with the push of a button, we can transfer what is called our social graph, and we will force interoperability on Facebook, then we eliminate the most important barrier to entry, barrier to competition of Facebook, and this could be done. You know, Facebook says, I need this monopoly in order to invest in innovation and so on. This is not true. You know, we can have, you know, if we really want to connect the world, if we have interoperability that all networks can connect, actually we're doing much better work of connecting the world without having one gatekeeper, one individual that, by the way, not only controls the entire market, but also controls the company with a very strange corporate governance structure of dual shares, A and B, with controlling shareholder. So even if shareholders hate him and want to fire them. They can't do it. So we'd rather see, a marketplace where people can easily compete and we can easily transfer to competitors that will offer us maybe the same services. We want to connect with family, we want to follow people, and so on and so forth. But we don't want to do it in a walled garden where we are constantly targeted by and manipulated by commercial advertising and political advertising. And as we know from research, a lot of people cannot differentiate between what is advertising, what is real news, what is fake news, and so on and so forth. And the current monopolistic gatekeeping actually is very supportive of this environment.
Yeah, I think the term deregulation is generally a misnomer, because what we think of as deregulation has generally meant replacing one set of rules with another set of rules. And the general trend since the 1970s has been to replace relatively simple, easy to understand rules with much more complicated rules. So that's certainly been what's happened in antitrust law. So in the 1960s, we had merger policy that was relatively straightforward. If you had more than X% of market, you couldn't buy out a rival. And we've replaced that easy, transparent system with something much more complicated that depends on the likely effects of a merger. So my colleagues and I at the Open Markets Institute, we strongly favor what we call bright lines, so simple rules of the road that any player, big or small, can understand and comply with. We don't want a system where you have to hire an army of lawyers and economists to navigate through and figure out whether you're in compliance or not. So yes, I think simplicity should be favored, and we should have a strong presumption in favor of simplicity moving forward.
A short comment on deregulation. I mean, there's absolutely no regulation within the space of tech in Europe. So deregulation from what? I mean, because there's no regulation. We have the general data protection regulation, but that's not an antitrust regulation I mean, that's just data. And so no, I'm in favor of starting to regulate rather than deregulate, because there's nothing in the current space.
Let's do one more question.
My name's Al Schneider. Big fan of the prospect and enjoyed the presentation today. I'm just wondering whether a lot of the divide between more conservative and progressive folks looking at this issue comes from maybe their differences on two axes. One, whether concentration is an anomaly in markets or is a kind of an inevitability almost, the way our capitalist economies are set up. And then second, whether regulation can be an effective tool given all the problems we've seen in designing regulations and enforcing them and so on, and the issues with regulatory capture. So I'd be interested to just hear some of the thoughts on those two subjects.
Yeah, I'll take the first stab at that. You're right. If you read a lot of the work of Chicago School and other conservative scholars, there is this air of unavoidability that giantism was preordained, that we acquire certain efficiencies and other social benefits by virtue of scale, and that trying to stop that is almost standing in the face of progress. And on the progressive left, you're increasingly seeing a recognition that none of this is unavoidable. It's all the product of various political and legal choices. And sure, there might be efficiencies associated with monopoly or oligopoly, but that is a political choice for us to make as members of a society. Do we want to have a more fair, equitable marketplace, or do we simply want everything at the lowest price possible? On the regulation versus, I gather, structural approach, both are really important. So even if we do break up Facebook or Google, we'll still have to have rules on fair competition and fair dealing. How do these mini Facebooks interact with advertisers? How do they interact with users? So we should reject the false dichotomy of structure versus regulatory conduct. We need both, and we really need to think a lot about how they fit together and what types of rules we want to pursue.
I want to thank everybody for speaking, and most of all for listening to this fascinating conversation. We're going to, I believe, break for lunch, and then we'll be back at 1 o'clock with a panel discussion on monopolies in healthcare and public policy issues. Thanks a lot.